She picked it up with 2 fingers, like it was something she found at the bottom of a junk drawer, held it at arm's length and said, "Dad, what are we supposed to do with this? It's not even pretty." That was my daughter talking about the painting my father made with his own hands in 1971. I'm 63 years old. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. I've been too soft when I should have been firm, too quiet when I should have spoken up. But I'll tell you right now, handing that painting to my daughter on her wedding anniversary was not one of those mistakes. What happened after that, though? That changed everything. And not just for her. My father, Clement, was a man who didn't say much. Grew up in rural Tennessee, one of 6 kids, never went past 10th grade. He worked 30 years at a paper mill in Kingsport and spent every weekend in the garage, not fixing cars, painting, watercolors mostly, landscapes, the mountains around our house, the creek behind the property, the old Methodist church where he married my mother. He wasn't a famous artist. He wasn't trying to be. He painted because it made him feel like himself, he told me once, like the noise went away when he picks up a brush. The painting he was most proud of was one he finished the spring before I left for college. It was a view of Clinch Mountain at dusk, the ridge going purple and orange, a white farmhouse sitting in the valley below, a single light in the window. He'd worked on it for almost 4 months. Came home from the mill, washed his hands, went straight to the garage. My mother used to set his dinner plate outside the door and knock twice. When he finished it, he didn't say anything for a few days. Then one Sunday morning at breakfast, he set it against the wall and said, "That one's done." And that was that. He hung it in the living room above the fireplace. It stayed there for 22 years when he passed. This was 9 years ago now, a Thursday in November, a stroke. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I was the one who drove up to settle the house. My sister Noreen lived out in Phoenix and couldn't make it for 2 weeks. I went alone, walked through every room, sat in his chair, opened his paint cabinet in the garage and just stood there for a while. I took the painting. I didn't think anyone would argue. Noreen got the truck, the tools, the dining set. I got a few boxes of things, some of his books and the painting. We never put it in writing. We didn't need to. I kept it wrapped in the back of my hall closet for almost 2 years. I couldn't figure out where to hang it. It felt too important to just put up anywhere. My wife Carol said I was being ridiculous, that it was meant to be seen, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I'd take it out sometimes and just sit with it. Look at that farmhouse, that single light. Wonder if he painted it from memory or imagination. Eventually I hung it in my study, and there it stayed for 7 years. My daughter Wren is 34. She married a man named Philip about 5 years ago. He's in commercial real estate. Nice enough, I suppose, in the way that a piece of furniture you didn't pick out is nice enough. He fills the room. He talks a lot about investments, square footage, cap rates. I've sat across from him at probably 60 dinners, and I still don't feel like I know him. But Wren loves him, so I love him too. That's how it works. Their 3rd anniversary was in April. I'd been thinking for a while about what to give them. Wren had mentioned once, maybe 2 years prior at Thanksgiving in passing, that she wished she had more of her grandfather's things around, that she didn't feel connected enough to that side of the family. She'd only been 7 when Clement died. She remembered him, but faintly. A big quiet man who smelled like turpentine and gave her peppermints from his shirt pocket. So I decided to give her the painting. I want to be clear about something. That painting was worth more to me than almost anything I owned. I'm not saying that lightly. I took it down from my study wall, and the nail hole in the plaster looked like a small wound. I sat with it in my lap for an hour before I wrapped it. Carol watched me from the doorway and didn't say anything, which meant she understood. I brought it to their house on a Saturday. We had lunch. Wren made chicken piccata. She's a good cook. And after we ate, I went out to the car and brought in the package. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. Old-fashioned. I wanted it to feel like what it was. I set it on the dining table and told Wren it had belonged to her grandfather, that he'd made it himself, that it had hung above his fireplace for 2 decades, that I thought she should have it now. She unwrapped it. Philip leaned in. There was a silence that went on just long enough for me to notice it. Then Wren said, "Oh, it's a landscape." I said yes, Clinch Mountain. He painted it in the spring of, but she'd already glanced at Philip. Philip said, "It's folk art, right? Like outsider art?" I said my father wasn't an outsider artist, he was just a man who painted for himself. Philip said, right, no, it's nice." He picked it up and tilted it toward the window the way you'd assess something at a yard sale. "It's not really our aesthetic though, is it?" He was looking at Wren when he said it. Wren said, "I mean, our whole thing is kind of clean lines. Modern. This is more." She paused. "It's very traditional." I said, "Your great-grandfather built the farmhouse in that painting." That wasn't true. I made that up on the spot, hoping it would land differently. I'm not proud of that." Wren said, "Oh, that's sweet." And she set it against the baseboard, leaning on the wall like she was trying to figure out where to put it while I was still sitting there. Then she said, "We might hang it in the guest room, or maybe the garage." She said it lightly like a joke, but it wasn't a joke. Philip had already picked up his phone. I drove home. Carol asked how it went. I said fine. She knew it wasn't fine, but she let it go. About a week later, I stopped by to drop off some mail that had come to my house by mistake. Wren still had a few things registered at my address, and I walked through to the kitchen. The painting wasn't in the living room. It wasn't in the hallway. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. On the way out, I noticed the door to their home office was open. The painting was in there, leaning against the wall behind the door, still in the brown paper, still tied with twine. It hadn't been unwrapped again. It had been there a week, and it hadn't been unwrapped again. I went home and sat in my car in the driveway for about 15 minutes. Carol came out and knocked on the window. I told her what I'd seen. She sat in the passenger seat. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. Here's the thing about grief. It doesn't always show up crying. Sometimes it shows up very quiet, very still, making calculations. I called Wren that evening. I told her I'd been thinking, and that I wanted the painting back. I said I'd decided it wasn't the right time to pass it on, that I wanted to hold on to it a little longer. I kept my voice even. She seemed relieved, if I'm honest. She seemed, of course. No problem. She'd have it ready any time I wanted to pick it up. She didn't ask why. She didn't say she'd hang it up before I changed my mind. She just said, "Sure." I picked it up 2 days later. It was still behind the door. Now, I need to tell you something I hadn't planned on doing. Something Carol talked me into, actually, about 6 months before all this happened. She'd read an article about regional American folk art and self-taught painters, and how the market for that kind of work had changed significantly in the last decade. She suggested, half joking, I think, that I should have Clement's painting looked at. Just out of curiosity, she'd found a place in Nashville, a gallery that also did appraisals. I'd brushed it off. I knew the painting had sentimental value. I didn't want to put a number on it. That felt like it would change something. But after I brought it home from Wren's office floor, I made an appointment. The appraiser's name was Dorothea. She was probably in her late 50s, glasses on a chain, the kind of calm that comes from spending decades looking at things carefully. I unwrapped a painting on her table and stepped back. She didn't say anything for almost 2 minutes. She put on different glasses. She looked at the back of the canvas. She asked me questions about my father, where he was from, where he'd worked, whether he'd shown anywhere, whether there were other pieces. I told her what I knew. She asked if she could keep it for 3 weeks. When I came back, she had a folder, my father's work, and there were apparently 7 other pieces she'd been able to trace through an estate sale in Kingsport 8 years ago, pieces a collector in Asheville had bought without knowing what he had been quietly gaining attention in the regional Appalachian folk art circuit. A curator at a small museum in Knoxville had written about one of his pieces in a journal 2 years ago. Dorothea had made some calls. She told me the painting was worth somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000. And that was a conservative estimate, she said, given the current interest. I drove home at 30 miles an hour below the speed limit. Carol had to remind me to eat dinner. I'm going to be honest with you. My first feeling was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated. It was grief, mostly, that my father had spent 30 years painting in a garage and never knew, that he'd died thinking he was just a man who liked to paint on weekends. That number, 60 to 90,000, felt like something he deserved to hear while he was still alive to hear it. Then I got sad about Ren. Then I got angry. Then I sat with all of it for a long time. Carol said she thought we should just keep the painting and not say anything. And I understood why she said that. But something in me had shifted. I contacted an auction house in Nashville, not Sotheby's, not Christie's, a regional house with a strong track record in American folk art and Southern regional work. They'd handled the sale of similar work the previous fall. I had a call with them. Then I had an in-person meeting. I brought the painting. They were interested, very interested. They told me the timing was good. There was a collector's auction coming up in 7 weeks. They had a buyer list they felt confident about, and pieces with a provenance story as clear as mine, a single owner, documented family history. The artist's other work, now in a private collection. That was exactly what certain buyers wanted. I signed the paperwork. I told Carol. She asked if I was sure. I said I was. I did not tell Ren. I want to say something about that. I thought about telling her. I almost called her a dozen times. I'd pick up the phone and then put it down. Part of me wanted to give her the chance to say she was sorry, to say she wanted it back, to ask to come to the auction with me. That part of me kept the phone nearby for a full week. But I kept thinking about that painting behind the door. Still wrapped, the twine still tied. 1 week, and she hadn't even opened it again. The auction was on a Tuesday evening. Carol and I drove to Nashville and sat in the back of the room. The auctioneer introduced the piece. He talked about Clement, his name, his background, the mill, the mountains, the 4 months it took to paint it. He talked about the provenance. He put the image on the screen behind him. The bidding started at 45,000. I had my wife's hand in mine, and I didn't let go. It went to 60, then 70. There was a pause. Then a phone bidder. Someone the auctioneer was relaying bids for came in at 75. The room went quiet for a moment. Then it stayed at 75. The gavel came down at $78,500. I didn't cry. I thought I might. I just sat there. On the drive home, Carol fell asleep in the passenger seat about 40 miles outside Nashville. I drove in the dark with the radio off. I thought about my father in the garage. The dinner plates set outside the door. The knock twice. The way he'd stood that painting against the wall one Sunday morning and said, "That one's done." He would have laughed. I know that with certainty. He would have laughed that big, slow laugh of his and said, "Well, I'll be." And then he'd have gone back to the garage. 3 days after the auction, Ren called to check in. Regular call, nothing special. She asked how I was doing. I said fine. She asked about Carol. I said Carol was well. There was the usual small talk about nothing much. Then she said, "Oh, I've been meaning to ask. What did you end up doing with that painting? Did you rehang it in your study?" I said no. I'd sold it. Silence. She said, "What do you mean, sold it?" I said I'd had it appraised and then consigned it to an auction house in Nashville. I said it had sold last Tuesday for just under $80,000. The silence this time was different. When she found her voice, she said, "Dad, that was Grandpa Clement's painting." I said yes, it was. She said, "You can't just... That was a family piece. That should have stayed in the family." I said I'd offered it to the family. I'd brought it to her house on a Saturday in April, wrapped it myself, tied it with twine, and 3 weeks later it was still behind the office door, still wrapped, still tied. I said all of that very calmly. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said Philip and she had just been trying to figure out where to put it. They hadn't forgotten about it. They were going to hang it. They just hadn't gotten to it yet. I said I understood. I said I hoped she'd understand too. She was crying a little by the end. That part was hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. Philip called me the next day. He was not calm. He used the phrase family heirloom 3 times in 5 minutes. He said I had no right. I let him talk. When he finished, I said the only thing I needed to say, which was that I'd given them the opportunity to have it, and they'd made their feelings about it clear, and I'd made a different decision. I said it once, and I didn't repeat it. He hung up. What I did with the money, I want to tell you this part. I donated $20,000 to the Appalachian Folk Art Archive at a small museum in Knoxville. The same museum whose curator had written about my father's work. I called them first and asked if they'd be interested in a donation in Clement's name. They were more than interested. They asked if I had anything else of his to contribute. I said I might, down the road. The rest I put in a separate account. Carol and I are talking about what to do with it. Maybe a trip somewhere. Maybe something practical. We haven't decided. I took down the nail hole in my study wall with a little wood filler, painted over it, hung a photograph of my father instead. Him in the garage, paint on his hands, not looking at the camera. My sister Noreen sent it to me years ago. It's small, just 4 by 6, in a simple frame. But when I sit at my desk, I can look up and see him. Wren and I haven't talked much since. There are texts here and there. She'll come around, I think. Or she won't. I can't hold the door open forever. What I know is this. My father spent 30 years making something beautiful in a cold garage in Tennessee, and nobody put a dollar figure on it until after he was gone. The least I could do was make sure it ended up somewhere it would be seen, properly. With his name attached, that painting is on permanent loan to the Knoxville Museum now. The family that bought it at auction donated it back within 6 months. They bought it as an investment, apparently, and decided it belonged in a public collection. I got a letter about it in January. I read it twice at the kitchen table while my coffee went cold. I called Noreen that evening. Told her the whole story, start to finish. She was quiet for a long time on the other end. Then she said, "He would have hated all of this fuss." And I laughed. For the first time in a long time about any of it, I laughed. She was right. He absolutely would have. He'd have wanted to know if the colors came through right on the museum wall, and then he'd have gone back to the garage. That's who he was. That's who I'm trying to remember. I still think about that nail hole in the study wall, the small dent in the plaster where the painting hung for 7 years. I filled it with wood filler and painted over it, but I know exactly where it is. I always will. What happened with my daughter wasn't something I planned for. I didn't walk into her house that Saturday hoping to be hurt. I brought that painting because I loved her, and because I thought she was ready to carry something forward. I was wrong about that, and what followed, the appraisal, the auction, the phone call that changed things between us, all of it came directly from a single afternoon and a single sentence. It's not really our aesthetic. That's all it took. Not cruelty exactly. Just a particular kind of carelessness. And carelessness has a way of costing people more than they expect. I don't think my daughter is a bad person. I want to be clear about that. But I'd had a lot of time to sit with what happened, and the honest truth is she'd stopped paying attention. Not just to the painting, to what the painting meant, to the man who made it, to the fact that her grandfather had spent 30 years making something beautiful in a cold garage, and never once heard anyone call it valuable. When you stop paying attention to those things, you make decisions that seem small in the moment, and aren't small at all. My father, Clement, had something I've tried to hold on to my whole life. He knew what he was doing, and why he was doing it, and he didn't need anyone to confirm it for him. He painted because it was honest work. He didn't complain about the long hours at the mill. He didn't talk much about what things cost or what they were worth. He just did the work in front of him with the time he had, that kind of quiet steadiness, the ability to keep going without applause, without validation, without anyone putting a number on what you've made. I think that's one of the hardest things a person can hold on to in this world. Most people can't do it. Most people need to be told they matter. My father never seemed to need that. I've spent 63 years trying to be more like him. The other thing I keep coming back to is the decision to have the painting appraised in the first place. Carol nudged me toward it, and I resisted. I thought putting a dollar figure on it would cheapen something. What I understand now is that I was confusing two different things, the painting's sentimental value and its place in the larger world. Understanding the difference between those two things isn't cold, it's clear-eyed. It's the kind of thinking that lets you act instead of just feel. I should have been clearer-eyed sooner. If I had been, maybe the painting would still be on my wall, or maybe it would have ended up exactly where it is now, on the museum wall in Knoxville, with my father's name on a small card beside it. I think about that card sometimes. His name, written out in a place where strangers stop and look. He never needed it, but I'm glad it's there. What I'd say to anyone watching this, not as a lesson, just as something I lived through, is that the things you carry forward from the people you've loved deserve more than a corner behind a door. They deserve your full attention. And if you can't give them that, you should say so honestly, because the people offering them to you are offering more than an object. They're offering you a piece of something that can't be replaced. When that kind of offering gets set down carelessly, something shifts. Quietly, without announcement, something shifts. And sometimes it doesn't shift back. Noreen said my father would have hated all the fuss. She was right. But I think he would have liked the museum. I think he would have wanted to know if the colors came through right on the wall,